New York City, the Upper East Side, a serial murderer. It all happens in Mapping the Night, the new thriller by John David Bethel, and it all starts right here, right now on Guys TV. You can also catch me on KCAA Radio in Southern California, Guys Radio, my worldwide podcast, and we're on UK Health Radio all weekend long. Guys TV, Guys Radio. Thanks for your support. Okay, Guys Radio, it is the interview portion of our show, welcoming our YouTube and Rumble viewers to the show. And today we're going to talk about a thriller. We're going to talk about a crime novel, a thriller that takes place in my hometown, New York City. And our special guest is J. David Bethel, a crime and conspiracy writer. He's written a number of books, including Evil Town, Hold Back the Dark, Mapping the Dark, which we're going to talk about today. And it's a fascinating story. David's background, he's got 35 years in politics and government at the senior level in congressional offices within the executive branch. And he has set his novels in Washington, internationally, and Mapping the Night is the first book that takes place in New York. So I was reading it very closely because I know I lived in New York City for 32 years. So I'm really very familiar with Manhattan, particularly. David's mom grew up in Brooklyn, and David spent a lot of his childhood living abroad. And his dad was a press attaché for the embassy, and he got to meet a lot of different people and learned a lot about government. And the new book, which is coming out now, let me hold it up for you, is called, I just finished it, Mapping the Night, John David Bethel. So welcome to the show, David. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm fine. Anxious to talk to you.
Okay, well, don't be anxious. Be eager.
There we go. Eager. I'm a man of words. I should have known that.
There's nothing to be anxious about on Guys Radio, because we're here. What we do on the show, David, is we bring information out there to help our listeners and viewers. And that's basically it. We have some fun and some entertainment, and we have great conversations. And you're adding to the 700 folks who've already been on the show. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's start out by talking about your dad's background in foreign service. My dad was in international business. He had some carryover work that he never spoke about some of the things he might have been doing before he passed. And I'm curious about what was your experience growing up with a dad who was involved with the government and internationally?
Well, I spent the first 14 of my years of my life overseas. I didn't live in the United States, basically, although we came back and visited occasionally. And we came back to Brooklyn, as a matter of fact. That's where my mom was born and grew up and where my grandparents lived. But I went to like 10 schools before I ever got back to the United States. I did finish high school in the United States. It was exciting. I mean, in hindsight, it was exciting. When I'm in the middle of it, it was probably a little daunting because you can't really make friends. You're moving every 2 years, maybe sometimes more than that. We lived in 3 different cities in Japan, so we were moving like every, I don't know, every 11 months or so. So that, that was a little tough, but it does give you a different perspective on life, and I think it broadens your outlook. And it did offer me an opportunity to meet a lot of people that I took for granted, but I had no relative experience. For instance, I met Fidel Castro, I met Jackie Robinson,
Wow.
I met a number of Ernest Hemingway, Errol Flynn. I had these opportunities of Faulkner, the writer Faulkner, that I didn't know at the time were that important. Only, as I grew up and I started reading some of these people and watching some of their movies, in the case of Errol Flynn, that I realized how fortunate I was.
So where you lived in 3 cities in Japan. Did you live any place else internationally?
Yeah, I lived in Germany. We lived in 3 different cities in Germany, and I lived in Havana, Cuba for a time as well.
My
And then
goodness.
there were periods where we came back to the United States. I think I spent 6 months in Honolulu, 3 months in Norfolk, and then in and out of Brooklyn, as I mentioned a number of times.
Now, besides speaking Brooklyn, did you learn how to speak Japanese and German and Spanish?
I still speak Spanish. Yes, I speak Spanish fairly well. My wife is Cuban, so we speak Spanish quite a bit. Japanese, not so much. I think when I was there, I probably remembered a few more words than I do now. I don't, I can't recall too many. Now, German actually was my first language, and I can't speak a word of it now. But when I was little, I guess I was about 3, 4, 5, 6 years old when we were over there. My mom said I spoke perfect German. As a matter of fact, when we came back to Brooklyn the first time, I listened, I heard Yiddish, thought it was, thought it was German, and talked to some of these people in German, and being, a largely Jewish area, and this
Sure.
not being that long after World War II, they weren't real happy with me.
hmm I visited Hamburg last year, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was such an interesting city. Did you recall anything? Did you live around Hamburg, or was it Berlin, or where were you?
We were in Berlin, Bremerhaven, and Bremen, the three
Mhm.
cities that I recall. Again, it's all very
Right.
foggy memory to me,
hmm
but I do remember those names, let's put it that way.
And what was your favorite place to growing up? What was your favorite place to live out of those three areas? Cuba, Europe, and Germany, and Japan.
Well, and this might be just a factor of the fact that I was old
Age and
enough
all that.
to
Yeah.
remember a lot, but Havana, Cuba was a beautiful, beautiful city, and it was before Castro ruined the country, and it was very cosmopolitan, very European. We were there for 3 years, and my sister actually went back to visit and was totally depressed by what's happened to the city, but and the Cuban people. I mean, I
Mhm.
love the Cuban people, and when my dad retired and we lived in Miami, and of course, half of the Cuban nation is now living in Miami. So I kept up with the language and with the people and everything else. But what many people don't know is that the Cuba was next to the United States and Canada, had the largest middle class, thriving middle class in the Americas before Castro took the toilet.
hmm it's interesting. I directed advertising for Bacardi, so I used to go to Miami all the time. And my clients there was a front group of people we dealt with, the marketing people, and then there was the Bacardi family behind them. And I used to say, "What do you like so much about Miami?" And they said, "Well, it's so close to the United States." And
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
right there's
Exactly. Well, the official language of the city now is Spanish, and they say that 70% of the people that live there are Latin. Only
mhm.
30% is Anglo. So it's
It,
basically a city in the Caribbean.
It's amazing. And the Cuban people, such hardworking, industrious, good looking, fun people. I really enjoyed working with the folks there, and I enjoyed Miami also. So tell us a little bit about your dad's work, and we'll segue into the books from there, because I'm sure that, having that experience of having your living in foreign countries, having your dad part of the government, meeting some of these famous people. I'd love to hear about how you got to meet Fidel, and how you got to meet Jackie Robinson, and Errol Flynn, and Hemingway. But tell us a little bit about that part of your life, your dad's business, what you kind of picked up as to what he was doing, and as you grew older, what you managed to glean from that you could take with you as part of your creative art.
Well, again, when you're growing up in the middle of it, you have no relative experience, and the kids that you're playing around with and everything, we're all in the same boat. So we didn't know really that this was not the way the rest of the world was living. I mean, I knew there was a country of the United States. I knew that's where I came from, and when we came back and visited, I knew it was different from where we were. But to answer your question, it was different. It was exciting, and to always be traveling. We traveled on giant ocean liners. We traveled on those big Pan Am planes that had the
Mm,
berths on them
sure.
and everything else. Um, as far as the experience, for instance, meeting these various people, my dad being a press attaché, he was the liaison between people, famous people, let's say, entertainers, politicians, athletes, when they would come to these various countries, he was the liaison between them, their people, and the press. So
Okay.
when we were in Havana, for instance, my dad put together the first press conference, international press conference for Fidel Castro about a week after he came into power. And it was one of these big fancy hotels. That they did have big fancy hotels back then. Um, and it was at the top of this hotel. I remember that. It was at a revolving restaurant. And he took me down. He had Castro stashed in one of the hotel rooms of this big place, a green room, I guess you'd call it these days. So he took me with him down to this room where Castro was. And again, all of us who were living in Cuba at the time knew what was going on. We knew the players, the Batista, who was the dictator at the time, Castro and his folks. It was a civil war, basically. So we walk into this room and there's Castro. He's sitting on a couch with on one side is Che Guevara, on the other one side is his brother Raul.
Mhm.
And behind them are their security people. They called them barbudos because they were all these guys. They'd just come out of the mountains. They were all bearded and they were carrying their automatic weapons. So that was, that fascinating as a 12-year-old, or actually I was 11, to see all this going on. And then Castro gets up and he approaches my dad and they're talking. And my dad is explaining to Castro what the setup's going to be. And of course, every little kid compares his father to, or compares other people to his father's size and all this sort of thing. Castro's a big guy, about 6'2". My dad was about that size. So I was impressed. I automatically impressed because he's dressed. He's also dressed in a military uniform. I had a sidearm that I was fascinated with, and he could tell. Again, I'm not listening to what they're saying. I'm just staring at this gun that he's carrying on his side. So Castro looks down at me and looks up at my dad and says, "He's your son here is." I have a little boy about your son's age, and they're all fascinated with guns. Would you mind if I took the clip out and made sure there wasn't any a bullet in the chamber? Can I hand him my gun? So I'm just thrilled. I am playing with this gun, and eventually, of course, I had to give it back. And we're on our way back up in the elevator to the room upstairs. And Castro looks at me. He says, "I talk a lot, and your dad has it set up so that I'm sitting on a couch, and there's a table in front of me." By the way, his English was pretty good. I spoke Spanish, and we kind of got
Mhm.
understood each other, speaking both back and forth. But his English was pretty good. He went to Columbia Law School, I think, for a while. Anyway, so he says, I talk a lot. There's going to be this table, coffee table in front of the couch, and there's going to be some water, a pitcher of water on it. So I'm going to give you the high sign every time I point at you. I want you to pour me some water and hand it to me. So I'm thrilled. I'm part of this whole event. So I'm really feeling pretty good about myself. But now the press conference, of course, starts to drone on. I'm not paying any attention because, frankly, I don't care. Um, and I noticed at some point there that Castro was having an argument with one of the press people, an American, of course, who was wanted him to answer the question: would he allow casinos to continue operating in Cuba after he, put together his administration? And Castro, for whatever reason, didn't want to answer the question. Well, the American, being an American and being a press guy, he kept pushing it. And at some point, I noticed that this was not good. It was not going well. And I looked up at Castro, and they talk about the way some of these deviant personalities that I write about, their whole demeanor changes. They compartmentalize their psychology. It goes from being a normal person to being this monster who does the things that he does. This look came over Castro where his eyes, it turned into shark eyes, and he just got this demeanor, and he looked at this press guy and he said, if you keep asking me these questions that I don't want to answer. And then he turns to his barbudos who are behind him, his security people. He says, I'm going to have them lift you up and take you out of here. Talk about things that I take with me when I write. That visage of him changing personality so quickly. When I describe these people in my books, I go back to that visage. So that was an experience for me. And as far as meeting Jackie Robinson, that was one of the highlights of my life. Um, it's hard for people. I don't even think you're old enough, but it's hard enough for people to understand what that meant in terms of a change, not only in the game of baseball, but just in society, to have a black man playing in what was then, the nation's pastime. Football and baseball, I mean, football and basketball were merely, stepchildren to baseball back at that point. So when Jackie Robinson came in and did as well as he did, it was just an amazing situation. And for those of us growing up at the time, it was an eye opener because, you know, well, I should say we, not me. I didn't grow up in a segregated society. I grew up in a totally different world, but the American children grew up in a segregated society. So seeing him come into the league and do as well as he did must have been a tremendous eye opener. Walter O'Malley became friendly with my father when they were in Japan, because they were doing a barnstorming tour through Japan. The Dodgers were. This was after their 55 World Series, I think it was 55 or 56. Anyway, so he invites us to have breakfast with him at the Imperial Hotel in downtown Tokyo. And I think my dad says, "You want to go have breakfast with us?" And okay, fine. I didn't realize we were having breakfast with the entire team. They had a big long table set up. And when we came in, and I don't think my parents understood this was what was going to happen either. And they sit us down with all the Dodgers, and sitting next to me is Jackie Robinson. Of course, I'm speechless at the time. And I actually did not have a conversation with him until the next day when Walter O'Malley allowed me to sit in the dugout with the Dodgers, who were playing against an all-star team from Japan, and Jackie Robinson sat down next to me. And of course, I want to talk about baseball. I want to learn about the people he had just played in the World Series against: Mickey Mantle, Yogi
Right.
Berra, Whitey Ford, and his teammates, Duke Snider, Pee Wee Reese, Gil Hodges, Roy Campanella, all of these names who were just magical to those of us who followed baseball at the time. All he wanted to talk about was my experiences in Japan and how I got along with the Japanese kids. And although at the time I didn't put it all together, but when you think back, this is what made the guy special. He
Yep.
didn't want to talk about himself or the game of baseball. He wanted to learn something from someone else. And so that stuck with me.
Fantastic. Okay, my special guest on Guys Radio is thriller author John David Bethel. We're going to get to his book, Mapping the Night. I want to lead up to it with some background because you really go deep in this story. It's about there's two FBI agents. There's some corrupt stuff going on from higher ends inside the government. There's some CIA implications. There's some New York City cops. There's some politics going on within the whole connectivity between the cops, the FBI, the CIA, etc. And then you've got a serial killer on a loose, and then you've got two other characters: a young guy who has to live in the dark, and then a young girl who's dying of cancer who somehow connect in Central Park. So before we get into the book, David, could you please explain to us, what was your jobs and how did your particular work lead you to writing, and when did you start writing?
Oh, I've always been interested in writing. I don't know exactly when the writing bug hit me. All I can tell you is that we mentioned my traveling so much, and I would miss large periods of school, sometimes up to a month or more. And my parents made me read, um, all the time. So I became a voracious reader. And then one day I decided, "Hey, I'm going to try this. I think I can write something." So I wrote a short story. I'll never forget about it. About that. And my dad took it to the office, had a secretary type it up, and from that point forward, I figured myself I was a published writer from that point forward. But
Fantastic.
that's what led me to writing that. And I spent a summer as an intern on Capitol Hill with a senator from Florida, and I realized that these guys, they need writers. I didn't know how I was going to transfer my love of writing to making a living, and most people told me don't even talk about it because it's not going to happen. You can't make a living as a writer. But I started doing some writing for him, for the senator, writing some floor speeches and things like that. And it just went from there. I managed to catch on with a congressman from California, and from there I went over to the Senate side with Senator Paul Laxalt from Nevada, who
Hmm.
just coincidentally was a close friend of Ronald Reagan. They
Right.
were fellow governors, one in Nevada, that was Laxalt, and of course Reagan in California. They became personally friend, and Laxalt ended up being his campaign manager and being very close to him during his 8 years in Washington. Long story short, I ended up as a speechwriter and press secretary for a bunch of cabinet officers in Washington, and that's how that all happened. I guess like most people in life, there are a lot of things that just fall into your lap, and if you're smart, you take advantage of them, and that's pretty much the way it happened with me.
Okay. Let's talk about your other books leading up to this book, because I sensed, I might be wrong, that some of these characters may have shown up in other books and they're now in Mapping the Night. Is that true? So talk to us a little bit about that, because while reading, I'm like, okay, I'm getting different parts of different character stories throughout the book, and it's an intricate weaving process that you've created, which keeps the reader, moving and on point. But then I start to think maybe some of these characters have been in David's other books. Is that the case?
Yeah, the FBI agents, the special agents, the woman, Eileen Prado, and the
Prado and
man I
Fisher. Yeah,
yeah, they're in two other books, and as you sensed by them backtracking sometimes and going through some history that they had, or one of them talking to somebody else and saying, "Well, this is what she did before this." Yes, those two characters show up in some other books, and I think the reason is it almost happened organically. I just like these two characters,
mhm,
and they just I don't think I went into the books I'm writing with the idea that I'm going to write a book with these two characters, but as I started with the plot and the plot started developing, I saw an avenue for them to be slipped into the book, and that's how that happened.
right. And it's a standalone, so you don't have to read we want
Oh no.
everybody to read the other books, but you can just read this one. It's a standalone story, and that's pretty cool that these characters show up in the other books. So, how did you choose New York City for this particular book? And I think you had read an article or something about a crime that happened that was kind of similar to what you based conceptually this book on. Talk to us about that, David.
Yes, exactly. I read an article in the New York Times about a woman who was found. Well, some cops went to do a welfare check on her because the people in her building had not seen her or her son for a few days, and they got worried. So the cops went to do this welfare check. Unfortunately, they discovered the woman had been strangled. She was dead. She was in her bed, and her son was applying ice to her face. He was only like 3 or 4 years old. You can imagine that scene, because
Sure.
he said his mother had this is the way she treated him when he was sick. So he was trying to revive her. Very haunting scene. And then when I got deeper into it, I found out that the guy who ended up being the serial killer, had killed various other people in this area of New York. And in each instance, there are two other elements that tied into it. In each instance, the apartments were cleaned immaculately, almost to the point of like, what the hell's going on here with this apartment? It looks like it's spick and span. And he was the one that was cleaning up the apartment. It was a little psychological thing he had going on with himself, and he targeted women with boys, because he was what you call a mission serial killer, and he thought he was saving these boys from a life of problems, just like he had with his mother, that kind of thing. And I won't get too deeply in that, because
Mhm.
it
Right.
without the context of the book, it doesn't really make sense. And that's how that started. And that's how all my books start. All are based on true crime elements. I find something that nags at me, that a scene like the one from Mapping the Night, or something else, and I use that and start the book and write. And I write from the seat of my pants, basically. I don't use an outline. I've never used an outline. I don't have backstories for my characters. I sit down, I write out that one scene from Map in the Night, and I just go from there. Whatever comes out of the computer comes out of the computer. Sometimes I don't even know what's going to be on the next page, and I sure as hell don't know what the ending of the book's going to be.
Mhm. Tell us about the main character in the book.
Which main character?
That's why I'm asking the question, because as I was tracking along, I had Prado and Fisher, and then Nadine Robinson, the New York City kind of a senior police chief type of person. She's not the head of the whole department, but she's kind of in charge of the situation. And then you have this young man who has an issue with he can't be out in the daylight, so he's the one out mapping the night, if you will, and he's trailed by this young girl who has cancer, and she is being funded by some billionaire who's sending her a private car to send her to and from school and taking care of her treatments and everything. And somehow she starts trailing this young man. So that when they're in the Central Park, there's a whole world going on in Central Park. That, and I lived in New York for 32 years, and when it got dark, I knew enough, like, don't take your chances. You can go through there sometimes, but don't make a habit of it. How did you get so much insight into some of those inner workings of what goes on in Central Park in the wee hours of the night?
Well, I read some police reports on Central Park on things that they have been called into to adjudicate, or if you will, or to control in Central Park. So there was that, and then some of the characters that they came into contact with. Now, none of the characters that I mentioned in my book that are part of the Central Park crew that's in there are real life people. I use my imagination after reading those reports. But basically, I suppose that Warren Winston, the one you're talking about, who has the condition that
Mhm.
where he's allergic to sunlight, and he can't go out in the daytime, and he has to live in the dark, even in his apartment in the Plaza Hotel. It might be the most main of the characters. And he's the one that I placed. Now, I had to have a way to introduce the reader to mapping the night, to the dark of the night. The best way that I figured I could do it was with someone who had a reason to be out late at night, who was not a nutcase, who was totally normal. And I read about this condition, which you know makes people stay out of the daylight, but he can map the night. He goes out every night and has done it for years, his whole life, wanders around the upper east and west sides of New York, and has grown familiar with every little landmark, knows everything about every little landmark. As you know, that he schools this young lady who follows him around. And her backstory is, yes, all the things you said, but she's also living in the Plaza Hotel where he lives, and she gets antsy because she's stuck in all day long because of her cancer. And one night she sees him leave the building. I guess she's standing at a window or something. So she decides, well, screw this. I can't stay in here anymore. So she starts following him around, and he eventually figures out someone's following him, and that's how they join up. They become a pair, and they're the ones who track this serial killer along with the police and the FBI.
Amazing. My special guest on Guys Radio, John David Bethel. We're talking about the new book, the new crime thriller, Mapping the Night. What drew you to thrillers as a genre, David?
Well, I started out by writing political thrillers, and then I got dragged into a book by a detective who came to me with a story that he had, one of his cases, and he wanted me to write a true crime novel about it. Um, and that's what got me, started. I worked with him on it. Ended up being a novel, not a true crime novel, because that's just not my milieu. But it was based on a true story that he had about a man who was kidnapped, tortured, and extorted of all his money. This is back in the mid '90s, and I used that as the basis for the story. I even, sat down with the victim. I sat down with the private investigator, and he had just massive files on the whole case. It tucked in that accidentally was a file on a serial killer case that he worked, where he was a consultant to try and catch the Key West serial killer who was eventually nabbed. Anyway, I read through that file, and I just became fascinated by the whole psychology of these people, the deviant psychology. And I read lots of books, and I read lots of true crime novels. I mean, books, true crime books. The problem for me with a true crime book is you've got the who, what, where, when. I wanted to know why. And I can't get that from a true crime book. I mean, I can get their version, their reading of why, but I wanted my why. I wanted to know why. So I started writing these novels based on these deviant personalities, and I created my own whys for myself. But they're based on information, real psychology that I got from the FBI, that I got from journals on psychology, that I got from other people who were experts in the field. I talked to them, so it's not some fantasy thing. I mean, it's real, and I can write a profile now of a serial killer based on all the information that I've learned.
It's amazing when you read the book. You're along for the ride. I'm not sure what you call this style, but the as a reader, you're working alongside the detectives and also the other characters and trying to piece together, okay, who did it, and then you have an idea because they're saying they figured out who did it, and then how are they going to catch this character? And it's kind of a chase, and it's a step by step. It's a process, and you have a lot of pieces, jigsaw puzzle pieces that have to fit together. So congratulations on weaving all that. That's not easy to build a plot that works that way on different levels. it's like a 3D type of plot. So good job there. Tell us about the importance of New York City as I think of it as a character in your story. In my book, it all takes place in New York also, except there's some scenes down the Jersey Shore for a getaway type of thing. But New York is such a powerful experience. And I realize that more since I've moved away, that when you're in it, you're like in the midst of it, and it's just going fast all around you and through you. But it is a different type of place. And I've traveled all around the world also, and there's nothing like New York City, for better and for worse at times, but it is an experience. Talk to us about your take on New York City, and is it a character in your book, and what do you think about that character?
Well, it's definitely a character, and there are probably multiple reasons, or two main reasons, let's put it that way, why I use New York City. The first one is, I think I mentioned that the first American city that I spent any time in as a boy, because I traveled so much, was New York,
Mhm.
New York City. So that has a special meaning to me. And I remember my grandparents and parents would take me into New York City from Brooklyn. It was always very exciting, all the museums and the Radio City Music Hall. I remember going there and seeing the Rockettes on Christmas, and then going to the laundromat across, not the laundromat, what they call that, the thing across this automat across
Automatic.
this. Yeah,
Horn and Hardock, right?
there you go. Yes, yes. I wouldn't remember that name.
Well, I just read about it because somebody's a millennial's trying to bring it back.
Oh, really? Okay.
Just
Well, that's
update it for
exciting.
today's time. Yeah, it's cool.
Well, they do that in Japan now. Actually,
Yep.
they have those kind of places. Anyway, so all of, I mean, for me, it was a magical place for those reasons. And again, the Dodgers, my grandfather, the borough of Brooklyn was just nuts for the Dodgers. So every time I went back, they took me to a baseball game. The second thing is, so it has a special place. The second thing is the original crime occurred in New York. And so once I decided that I was going to use that crime as the basis for my novel, I was kind of happy because I had an opportunity to place it in New York. And of course, New York is definitely a character in the novel because it's mapping the night of places in New York. And I was excited because I got to do research on the Plaza, on the Dakota, on
Mhm.
Central Park,
And great
and
job, by
everything.
the way, with the historic. I learned a lot just by reading I knew some of it, but you did a good job with the research.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it because no matter how much research I do, and I visited, I went to New York and I visited these
Mhm.
places, always in the back of my mind is nagging me. Did I miss something? Does this street not come out on that street? Or because I know in novels that I read, if I've been, for instance, spent some time in Miami, I've read a lot of books on Miami, and authors screw it up so badly.
I know.
They have, the ocean coming in at some place in the middle of the city where it doesn't work, and it just drives me nuts. So I wanted to be completely accurate. I'm glad to hear from a New Yorker that I did okay with that.
You did. You did. So, where in Brooklyn did you live?
We lived in
What
my
area?
grandma Flatbush, I guess. It
Okay.
was Church Avenue.
All right.
Church Avenue. I remember her
Okay.
dress was
Okay.
555 Church
Okay.
Avenue.
So the leap to the Upper East Side and Upper West Side of Manhattan in the Central Park South area, that's a different world, or truly
Oh,
a different world than Flatbush. So another way good job there. So did you get into the plaza now and walk around there? Because I remember when it was the
yes.
hotel and they had the tea room and everything there, and now it's like it's condos or something.
Yeah, well, the first, I guess, 12 stories are still a hotel, and then it goes up from there. The rest is condos. And yes, I spent some time actually in the plaza because my parents had friends that lived in that area. So that's how come that's why I know a little about that area, because we did spend time at their places when we came into New York. We would often, spend weeks at a time at their apartments, and I became familiar with the plaza, loved the plaza back. And there was that bar in the back with the Oak Room. I remember the
Right.
Oak Room.
Yep.
My parents used to take me to the Oak Room, and we have oysters. That was a very big deal to have oysters in the Oak Room. And that big, beautiful bar that they had there. Oh my
Mhm.
God. Even as a kid, I remember being impressed with that big, beautiful bar. So everything about the Upper East Side, New York, Central Park, of course, when you're a kid, it's fascinating, all that's going on in Central Park. And I had no idea that it was basically a pasture for people that raised sheep,
Right. Mhm.
prior to being the Central Park. So going back and being able to do that kind of research was all, very
That's a plus.
very educating, and also it made me happy to be able to do that.
Fantastic. Tell us about, and my special guest, John David Bethel, of the author of the new book, Mapping the Night. We're talking about crime thrillers. Tell us a little bit about your audience and your target audience, if you get to interact with the type of folks who like this type of book, and also some of the influences you've had from a writing standpoint.
Well, it's interesting because people ask me about if I write mysteries. No, they're not really mysteries because most of my books, who the bad guy is. It's a matter of how you're going to get there. How you're going
Mhm.
to figure out to bring him to justice, so to speak. The idea that you could do this, that you can use your mind to write these kind of books to figure out how to get the bad guy. Always, fascinated me, and the police work that was involved, the detective work. I remember, years ago, when I was younger, reading these books and being well, what's Sherlock Holmes. I read a lot of Sherlock Holmes. So, how do people do this? What is the mind game, the chess game that is played? So that always fascinated me. And I find that most of the people that read my books, when they get in touch with me, that's what they're interested in. Much more so, surprisingly to me, than in the character development. Uh, I my books are definitely plot driven, but
Yes.
I try to have interesting characters to help drive the plot. And the interesting thing is that I never get too many questions about the characters. Now, I think that Warren Winston is probably an interesting enough character that may change the dynamic. You asked me about it. Other people who I've talked to have asked me about him. So there's that dynamic, but people are mostly interested in plot. Not a lot of people
Mhm.
ask me about the intricacies of creating a character.
Now, the some of the backstory or like under the hood stuff between how the NYPD works with the FBI and the FBI with the CIA and the government involvement with a foreign country and the oil business. How did you get the information? What did you do to get the research to kind of weave all that together? Because it comes across as you know what you're talking about, and I say this with all respect that this guy really knows the inner workings of how this system, as tainted as it can be, but how it somehow functions. How did you manage to be able to weave all of that together?
Well, I think that's also a benefit of my experience in Washington. When you do deal with these people on a certain level all the time, and you understand where the hierarchy is. For example, CIA is always going to trump FBI, especially when they're working overseas. Um, the FBI can only go into a city and cooperate with the police if they're invited. Now that's the rule, but that's not generally the way it works. If the FBI wants to get involved in a case, they're going to find a way to get involved, whether that means that they have to work with somebody that's going to force the police to invite them into the case, then they will be invited. But the rule is that the FBI has to be invited in. It's a rule that's a little vague. As far as when things get dicey with the CIA working with other agencies, crime crime wise, the FBI is always going to trump local authorities. The local authorities are pretty much going to have to cooperate and have to give up control of a case if that's what the FBI wants. And as I said, when it gets to the international situation, the FBI, the CIA is always going to be on top of that. They can pretty much run the show if that's what they want to do.
Some say that the CIA is involved in the entertainment business and movie making and all aspects of our life. And a lot of people write a lot of stuff and a lot of movies are made that are really wagging a finger at some of the CIA's activities. Did you ever hear anything from anybody, from any branch of government saying, hey, you better be careful what you're saying about this or that?
No, not really. Maybe because I never I was never important enough, or I was never involved in anything that where I might have stepped on anybody's toes.
Mm.
But yes, you're right. You do hear about it. But a lot of it is crap, frankly. I mean, um, yes, the CIA can get involved in pretty much anything, but why would they want to? I mean, there are instances where they would give up control simply because they don't want the hassle, and the ends do not always justify the means. So a lot of it is really fiction. If it's important enough, they'll get involved, but if it's not going to bring them the end that they want, then they won't get involved.
Mhm. Makes perfect sense. So what's next for you, David?
Well, I'm going to keep on writing.
Do you wait for that news story to come flashing by? I mean, there's so much on, whether it's social media and all the different platforms that are out there. There's so many crazy things happening in our world today. Do you just, have the antenna out there, and when the right one comes, it's like, that's it. There's my next book.
Exactly. For instance, I'm working on a story now that started that way. I read an article in a magazine, in a newspaper, a Florida newspaper, about a professor who hit and ran. He hit and ran a vehicle, and a well-known professor in the area, a well-known professor who's done a lot of work in avionics, and he was found. He committed suicide and was found in the back of sitting back by the pool of a Holiday Inn. And my first question is, really, a suicide? The guy hit and runs. That's it. No one was hurt. What in the world? I first thing I thought was, there's more to this than meets the eye, and that starts the book I'm working on now.
Fantastic. Thank you for a sneak peek. That sounds like a real good one. So last question for you. Who has been, which writers in similar genres or just overall have influenced you, David?
Overall, I would have to say Ernest Hemingway and the writers of the Lost Generation, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, although I don't have anything in common with them as far as the subject matter and the way I write, just the idea that people could put together this wonderful language and write these wonderful stories. When I was growing up and then in college, I read as much as I could. Those are probably the biggest influence as far as I want to be a writer. As far as today, my writing goes, I don't really have one. I'll read anything I can get my hands on that I think is going to drive me forward, make me say, Jesus, I wish I could do that. I wish I could write like that. So, I'll read anything.
Fantastic. Well, listen, congrats on the new book, a thriller, Mapping the Night, John David Bethel. Tell everybody where they can find the book, when it comes out, and website or whatever else you have that you want to tell everybody about.
Well, they can go on Amazon, type in my name, and then that'll show up, as well as the rest of my books. They can go to Goodreads and do the same thing. My books will pop up, or they can go to www.johndavidbethel.com. That's my website, and they can find my books there.
Fantastic. Well, listen, great job. Congrats, and interesting conversation. And let's do it again sometime. Be well.
All right.
John David Bethel, thank you so much for being on Guys Radio.
Thank you very
If you
much.
enjoy the guests and content I bring you each and every week to Guys TV and Guys Radio, please support us by subscribing to our channels and platforms. Thank you.